Well, hello everyone and Happy New Year. This is our first video of 2026. And I hope that you enjoyed your holiday season, right? Through Christmas and New Year's, that you spent it with friends and family, and that you remember how blessed you feel in your life. God gives us great blessings all the time, and I hope that you feel that. One of the things I wanted to do today was continue the story of Jesus after his birth and show us how God uses people and circumstances for his will, right? There's that Bible verse that says God uses all things for the good of his will and for his glory. And so I wanted to show you some stuff in your Bible that really exemplifies that. And that's the continued story after Jesus' birth. We start in Luke chapter 2, verse 21, and it says, "On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise him, he was named Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he had been conceived. When the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons." Now, there's just a couple of things that I want to point out in this particular passage. Right after Jesus is born, he's circumcised on the 8th day. And then after 40 days, Mary is to present him at the temple because he's the firstborn male of his family. He's supposed to be consecrated to the Lord as laid out by the law that God had given the Israelites. Now, one of the other things that is done at this time is that Mary gives sacrifices for purification. And we see that with the 2 doves, the 2 pigeons. And I don't want to go into the sacrificial system because it's long, it's arduous, there's a lot to it, but needless to say, God made it simple for whether you're very wealthy or whether you're very poor to be able to present sacrifice to him. So in this instance where it says the 2, right, depending on your income level, that could be a bull and a dove, or maybe a lamb and a dove, a combination thereof. But the least expensive, the simplest sacrifice to make is the 2 doves or 2 pigeons, however you want to say it. And so what that establishes for us is something that I want you to know today, which is that Mary and Joseph were not rich people, right? They didn't have a lot of money. And we can be sure of that because we've seen their character at work, right? Their character to have an angel of the Lord appear, and those circumstances wouldn't dictate that what's going to happen to them is going to be in their favor. Nonetheless, they listen to God and they do what they've asked them to do. We also note that even after the birth of Jesus, right, Mary could be like, well, I'm so much better than everybody. I've given birth to Messiah. The rules don't apply to me anymore. Like, nothing's gone to her head, right? She continues to serve God as the Torah has laid out for her and her husband. And they go to the temple and they make this sacrifice, and they make the lowliest of sacrifices because that is what they can afford. I want you to kind of keep that little bit of knowledge in the back of your head as we move forward into the story of the Magi appearing. In Matthew chapter 2, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people, Israel. Now, when I read this, I look at myself. I don't literally look at myself, but I think to myself, who are the Magi? Right? In our nativity scenes, we show them there at the nativity. We have songs that call them the three kings of the Orient. But the interesting thing here is that our Bible doesn't say anything about them being kings. It says they're magi, and in other places it's wise men. But we've created these songs to make us think that there's some sort of royalty, but that really isn't the case. We've also diluted them down to three, but we don't actually know that either. Right? What we do know is that wise men or magi from the east have come to Jerusalem seeking the new king. Now, that leads me to think, so who are these people? Why did they show up? And how did they know? Right? They're clearly not Jewish. They're definitely Gentile people, which means they come from a pagan world where they don't follow the one true God, yet they recognized the sign in the sky, a star, that they knew was the sign of the birth of the King of the Jews. They knew it was the sign of the Messiah that was to be born, that he was the Son of God. Right? That's a great question, isn't it? If you haven't thought about it, today I'm going to give you the most probable answer to that. So we know they come from the east. We know that they're not Jewish. We also know that they know who the Jewish God is, and that they've seen a star. And some scientists over the years have tried to decipher what that star is and where it came from. And I don't think it's that important, other than to say I would suggest that it's most likely supernatural, right? If God has sent angels to Mary and Joseph and all these other things that God has done throughout the world, I think making a star appear probably wasn't that difficult for God. But anyway, back in time, if you remember, the Babylonians had invaded the land of Judah, and they tore down the first temple, and they carried off the higher ups, the royals of the nation of Judah, and they carried them off to Babylon. And one of those people that was brought was named Daniel. And I think most of us have heard the story of Daniel before, but Daniel gets brought to Babylon. He continues to follow God's law, and eventually he's put in a position of prominence because he's able to decipher the dreams of the king at that time. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, I want you to hear what this says about Daniel. It says, "Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all his wise men." Wasn't that interesting? Right? He's now in charge of all the wise men and rules over the entire province of Babylon. God has raised him to a great position, right? Something that was a punishment to the Israelites from God, which I'm not going to get into that at the moment, but it's a punishment. He uses this to further his will where the Messiah is concerned. Right? He takes a faithful man in Daniel and raises him up because he's handsome, he's intelligent, he never forsakes God and continues to follow him. And he becomes in charge of the wise men. Now, Daniel was very highly regarded, and you can read that throughout the story of Daniel if you want to take time to do that on your own. And so I think I would present to you that most likely Daniel put into the religious studies and the understanding of the wise men of the time of who God is, who the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is, and what those prophecies are. See, the wise men aren't kings necessarily, they're scholars, right? I think the name kind of implies that. Or magi, they're scholars, right? They're astronomers. Could be astrologers. Could be into apothecary, right? They study religions, they study gods, they study all kinds of different things. And so they have a knowledge of who the God of the Jews is because of Daniel. And because of that, they recognize the sign of the coming Messiah, the King of the Jews. And that's who God sends to meet Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Right? That he would choose some Gentiles that really don't have anything to do with God to come and gave them the knowledge some 500-600 years earlier to know the sign that would come. Also notice that the Jews didn't notice the sign. Right? If that star appeared in the sky, it had to have appeared for them as well. Yet they did not recognize the timing of the birth of the King of the Jews. Then I also notice when they came to King Herod, right, it would be logical to think that if you were one of the wise men, that if the King of the Jews was to be born and you were going to come and present to him, that he would be found in the capital, he'd be found in Jerusalem, and that's just not the case, right? We have Herod the Great sitting on the throne, and Herod the Great wasn't a very good guy, right? Herod the Great was, in fact, pretty nasty. He had his wife killed. He had 3 of his sons killed. He was a really nasty person. He was not the legitimate king of the Jews. He was appointed there by Rome to kind of do their bidding. So Herod's not a very good guy, but the wise men, they show up because they're thinking, we've come to pay homage to the King of the Jews. And of course, Herod doesn't know any of this. He's got to call his religious leaders and go, hey, wait a second, they're telling us the King of the Jews is born. Where's this supposed to happen? And they read to him from Micah that he will be born in Bethlehem, which is the home of David. We'll pick our story back up in verse 7 of Matthew chapter 2. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now notice that it doesn't say that the star stopped over the place where the child was born. It says that it stopped over the place where the child was, where he was currently. Right, we tend to think that the kings showed up, within days of Jesus being born, but that's just not true. Right, and we'll know that based on some of what we're going to read here further. But the star just didn't sit in the sky and shine for all this time until Jesus was born and then magically disappear. It showed up to lead the wise men, almost specifically. And so our Bible tells us that the star showed them where the child was. How old Jesus was at this time? We're not really sure. Right? I think we can be fairly sure that it's after the 40 days of them going to the temple and coming back to Bethlehem. But we're not 100% sure. We can be sure that he's under 2 years of age. And that's further in our reading. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. Again, more evidence that he wasn't still laying in the manger because they came to a house. They saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Right, notice that they show up, they bow down before the king. I think this has to be surprising for Mary, but at the same time, understandable. Right, after all, she knew she had given birth to a child that was conceived by the Holy Spirit. And so they leave 3 gifts, according to our text: gold, incense, and myrrh. Right? Some texts will say frankincense, but incense is what this particular version of my Bible reads, the New International Version. So they leave him these gifts. Now, I'm not sure what kind of gifts Jesus would do with these things, right? They smell good and it's gold, so it's a lot of money. And Mary and Joseph probably aren't saving for Jesus's college account. And just saying, things are a little different then. This is a very valuable thing that they've received. Remember, they're poor people. And I want you to see how God has taken the wise men that have the knowledge because of Daniel, who was brought there in captivity, have now provided the way for the next step in Jesus' journey. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So we got several things going on in play here, right? The Magi leave. God warns them. Again, God supernaturally is giving this baby, his son, the opportunity to escape by warning the Magi, right? This gives them time, right? We seem to read this and we think, oh, the Magi left and immediately Herod was ticked off and sent people into the streets to start murdering people, but that's just not how it happened, right? They leave, they go a different way. I would say you give Herod 1 to 2 weeks from the time the Magi left and went to Bethlehem to start going, hey, something is not right here. Maybe all of a sudden he starts getting reports that the Magi are seen 30 miles south of Jerusalem, heading back to the east again. And then he declares war on children under 2 years of age in Bethlehem and the surrounding vicinity. Now, meantime, once again, God has sent an angel to Joseph to warn him of what's to happen. Our text says that during the night he left under the cover of darkness with Mary and with Jesus. Now, I contend that without the gifts that the wise men brought, this probably wasn't possible. Right, every one of us has gone on a trip before, at least I assume we have. And if you haven't, I'm sorry for that. But if you've gone anywhere at all, if you've gone and stayed overnight somewhere, gone on a vacation, you know there's planning. You know you need to know where you're going. And you need money to make that happen. Right, there's going to be costs for travel, there's going to be costs for housing once you get there, and there's going to be costs for food once you get there as well, on the way there and the way back. That's no different for Joseph and Mary. They're going to need subsistence. It's not like Israel is a, one-day journey. It's quite a ways to go from Israel, Bethlehem, all the way to Egypt. And once you get to Egypt, now you got to establish a new life. But what does that take? Well, that takes money. And so God provided to Mary and Joseph what was needed to get Jesus out of there and to give him a safe journey to Egypt. Right? We tend to forget that part of the story. Right? But notice how God uses the wise men. Right? Uses the Babylonian captivity through Daniel to give the knowledge. The wise men hear God's intended plan, and whenever it comes to fruition, they see it and they go and they follow God's will, quite frankly, and they provide the means for Joseph to get his family to safety. And we can also deduce from this passage that it's probably been close to 2 years since the time Jesus was born. Right? It could be anywhere from 1 to 2 years since the time Jesus was born. Now, a lot of times this timing in Jesus' life is depicted by Joseph and Mary barely escaping the house. But I don't think that's how it probably worked. Right? God warned Joseph. Joseph said, yes, sir. And he probably took the next day to gather the things that were needed and get ready for the journey, and did leave Bethlehem under the cover of night and started traveling to Egypt. They probably needed a little bit of a head start, right? They're going to be on foot. Maybe he's able to afford to buy a donkey at that point in time. Right? But God is always working, even through circumstances that we can't predict. See, a lot of times in our lives, we see something happening that is bad or negative, or we don't like the immediate result of it, and we wonder where God is in our lives, but we don't know how God is working. And I wanted to end this particular teaching with a story from my own life. When I was a kid, I was 9, I believe. I had a brother who was born. His name was Jared, and he was born with holes in his heart and collapsed lungs, and it was a death sentence, quite frankly, at that time. Right? And he was in the Minneapolis Children's Hospital, and they did a surgery to put aortic patches onto his heart to help him to live, and it was successful. And it was one of the first times in the world that this was a successful surgery. And Jared lived to roughly 15, 16 months old. Most of that time was spent in the hospital. He did get to come home a couple times, but he eventually died. Now, that was hard on my family. Right? It was hard on my mom, especially, my uncle, my grandma, my brothers and sisters. And what we could see as a personal hardship to our family turned into something major. Right? His story was published in major medical journals. Right? This was a whole brand new thing that was created. Successful aortic patches that they lived. And so over the years, I've come to realize that Jared's death eventually led to tens of thousands of other babies having life. Right, and who knows what those babies went on to become. Right, for our family it looked like a tragedy, but at the same time, if I look at it through a different scope, I can see God's hand at work. And I want us to remember that as we go into the new year. Right, I want us to remember God's hand is at work. We might not see it, we might not understand it, but all he asks us to do is trust him and follow where he would have us to go. Thank you for listening today. I hope to see you all again next week. Merry Christmas again, Happy New Year, and God bless.